Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast and to our journey together through the art history of the High Renaissance in Rome. Today, we're going to travel some well-trotted territory and discuss a group of artworks, one of which is consistently touted as the very emblem of High Renaissance art itself, Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican. Now, my goal today is not to look at this fresco in isolation, but to properly explain how and why this particular artwork is just one part of a whole series and frankly should not be discussed as an individual artwork, but as the very beginning of a complex interaction between the concepts of philosophy and theology. In total, we're talking about Raphael's frescoes in one specific room in the Vatican Palace called the Stanza della Segnatura. Overall, Raphael and his workshop worked on a series of rooms in the Vatican Palace, and they are generally referred to as the Raphael stanze. It just means rooms. Stanze is the plural. We're talking about the stanza, the room, della Segnatura. We're looking primarily at this one stanza of the Segnatura, where the ungodly famous School of Athens is frescoed. Raphael Sanzio, Raphael of Urbino, he's the youngest of the big four of the Italian Renaissance, Donatello, Leonardo, and then Michelangelo, then comes Raphael. He was born in Urbino, where his father was the painter and a courtier, Giovanni Santi, but Raphael's mother and Giovanni Santi both died when Raphael was rather young. Still, he likely learned some of his skill from his father, then probably was an apprentice to Perugino in Perugia. Raphael's earliest work was indeed a brilliant synthesis of central Italian styles, namely his father's, Perugino's, and he would be exposed to artists like Luca Signorelli, who was also a major influence on Michelangelo's style, and Raphael would also be exposed to Pinturicchio, the central Italian school. Raphael then went to Florence, where he was in the city at the same time as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, the innovators of a new kind of naturalism and composition that Raphael readily adopted to refine his already synthesized style into something with an exceptionally new level of liveliness, harmony, and balance. So synthesizing a synthesized style again, and we're going to do it again, right? We see in his works from this period, the Florentine period, portraits like those of Agnolo and Maddalena Doni and his famous Madonna of the Goldfinch. By then, he was already considered a master painter, and he earned his reputation for being quite agreeable to work with, which really sets him apart from Michelangelo. And through synthesizing these styles, Raphael was certainly privy to the integration of ancient Greek and Roman art into his contemporary painting vocabulary. He would emulate this and understand it even, but going to Rome would once again add a new layer of synthesizing to his work, especially with all of physical antiquity at his fingertips. We are in the age of Pope Julius II, who spent an incredible amount of money in the cultivating of arts in Rome. If we remember, one of his earliest endeavors was that monumental tomb by Michelangelo, who he would then call back to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Julius, who had become pope after Borgia Pope Alexander VI, was living in the famous Borgia apartments upon the beginning of his reign. Those are the apartments painted by the Central Italian Pinturicchio from 1492 to 1494. However, as part of his massive decoration program and redevelopment, Julius began the renovations of another part of the palace where his former humanist Pope Nicholas V had lived. Julius used this skilled, controversial court architect by the name of Donato Bramante to lead those renovations in his new apartments and soon began hiring painters of the highest caliber to work on the decoration. There were painters from many of the major courts throughout Italy and beyond, Milan, Venice, even from the Netherlands today. There was also Perugino and Luca Signorelli. Additionally, there was the famed Sienese painter Giovanni Bazzi, also known as Il Sodoma, which is what we sometimes still call him today. It simply means the sodomite. And of course, Michelangelo, the Florentine, was called upon to do the Sistine ceiling. At this moment, sometime in late 1508, Raphael was summoned by the Pope to join this enormous project, and he was at the age of about 25. Why was Raphael summoned with all of the greatest painters of the peninsula? Well, in all likelihood, it was a suggestion by Bramante, who was leading the project. That is, Bramante of Urbino, the same small but mighty humanist court that Raphael was from. Of course, this idea of hyper regional pride is still very much alive in Italy today. So we can consider it likely that Bramante had a hand in singing the praises of this rising painter from Urbino, and thus he was summoned to Rome. Among the most remarkable occurrences in this moment, 1508, was all of this artistic activity going on and much older and more experienced masters present, Raphael still rose as the predominant painter in the project, won the Pope's favor, and ultimately was taking control of the decorating of the apartments. In January of 1509, Raphael was paid to paint the walls and the vaults of what would become one of the most praised works in all of Renaissance art period, the Stanza della Segnatura. So this room is one of in a string of rooms in Julius's apartment, as rooms in Renaissance palaces were often connected one after another along a single axis. That's typical of Renaissance palaces. This specific room in the series of rooms was the Pope's library and study. As such, the decorative scheme had to be the visual representation of branches of knowledge, where the walls and the vaults would work together to create a single harmonious conceptual visual experience. And as I said before, having the entire antique collection of the Pope right next door at hand, plus being surrounded by all the other great masters, we now see Raphael's most exceptional stylistic shift yet again in these frescoes with a new element of style to synthesize into his synthesized, resynthesized, synthesized again, synthesized style, the Roman element. In the medieval and Renaissance tradition, which they inherited from an older ancient Roman tradition, the liberal arts that was part of the academy, which were to be depicted in the library, should be in total 7. There are 7 liberal arts according to these traditions. The first 3 is called the trivium, that is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then there is the quadrivium, which is geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. We're in a 4-walled room with a vault, and Raphael reimagines, certainly with help of the rhetors of the Vatican Palace, reimagines this 7-part liberal arts into 4 parts, where each wall is further signaled by the allegorical figures on the ceiling vault. That is, those 4 parts: philosophy, theology, poetry, and jurisprudence or law. Okay, philosophy, theology, poetry, law. Those are our 4 parts of this room. Together, they do not merely encompass the branches of learning, they create a hierarchy of learning with a built-in directionality to the room. This is one of the most important parts and why I am very insistent that the School of Athens cannot be viewed in isolation. We are talking about hierarchy and we are talking about directionality. So these are not four isolated allegorical representations. No, 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 no. I will explain how they connect, but let me whip up some more context with the School of Athens, as we call it, but really it's the wall representative of one of those four parts, philosophy. It's philosophy, but we call it the School of Athens. Right off the bat, when we look at this fresco, the most striking aspect of it is its composition. It's a massive group of figures, but the superb perspective of the fresco and the architectural system immediately bring your eye to the two central figures. That is Plato and Aristotle. Almost the whole of Renaissance humanist thought is held in this pair. The debate between the Platonic and the Aristotelian thought. Plato holds one of his seminal works, the Timaeus, which is a dialogue that presents the idea of a single, get this, a single powerful creator called the demiurge, which Renaissance humanists easily saw their Christian God contained within. And so Platonic philosophy was a spiritual one of the cosmos and the unseen. I think I pronounced that right. Demiurge, demiurge, demiurge. I read it more than I speak it. So I don't demiurge, and I've never heard anyone say it. So don't, shout at me. The figure of Plato himself, said to be a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, which is really quite remarkable, he points upward to the heavens, a gesture that confirms the idea of what the Timaeus is saying, that this is a celestial, cosmic philosophy, right? But Aristotle, on the other hand, he holds his Nicomachean Ethics, which is a treatise on the very nature of the good itself within the life of humankind, looking towards a perfect good, which is entirely bound in the earthly realm. Thus, the figure of Aristotle points down to us, to humankind, to the material world, to the earth itself. A look to the vault of the ceiling, and you see that the allegorical figure of philosophy, with the words naturalis and moralis, praise both natural and moral philosophies.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. On the fresco wall, Raphael creates a dynamic group of all of the best known philosophers and thinkers of antiquity as they relate to Plato and Aristotle, who we have seen the debate in which they hold their most prominent works, which any learned humanist would recognize and understand that a synthesis is happening within the philosophical discourse on this wall. We see to Plato's left the pug-nosed Socrates having dialogue with the young corruptibles of Athens, and for it is through Plato that we get the Socratic dialogues. In the foreground below him is Pythagoras demonstrating his well-known Pythagorean theorem. I think that's what he's showing. It's the only math I could ever do myself. Other than that, I'm hopeless. And looking over Pythagoras' shoulder is the famed Arab mathematician and philosopher Averroes. very much signaled Arab. He was operating as a Muslim in Spain. And to the extreme right, we see Raphael himself as the famed ancient painter Apelles. Next to him is probably a painter of that Sienese artist Il Sodoma, and they stand with Zoroaster, that is the founding figure of Zoroastrianism, that Persian religion, who holds the celestial globe or the vault of heavens and looks an awful lot like the fellow Urbino courtier that we talked about, Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote the book of the courtier and who Raphael painted a portrait of. And bent down before them, doing a demonstration, is the figure of Euclid, who is probably a portrait of Donato Bramante, the Bramante who was the head of this project, giving him that honor of being Euclid, but also a spot of prestige in the immediate foreground, since it's likely that it was his influence that helped Raphael construct the magnificent architecture in the background of the painting. So we get this Bramantian architecture in the background, and we get a whole group that is this central Italian group. Sodoma, probably it could have been Perugino. I don't know. It's one of them. Perugino, Sodoma, Raphael, Bramante, Castiglione, all in one group in the School of Athens. And lastly, famously, most famously, if you look at the fresco, you might notice there is a lone figure in the immediate middle foreground, leaning on what could be considered an uncarved block of marble, who actually disturbs the composition of this fresco. He breaks it. And that is the brooding and the bleak Heraclitus, which is a portrait of the brooding and bleak Michelangelo. Remember, Michelangelo was at that moment painting the Sistine ceiling, hating it, complaining, kicking out his assistants, being a general pain in the rear end to everyone he encountered. However, this is only a mild dig, Michelangelo, because the portrait is done more so as a half way to honor him, maybe, since the dramatic twisting form of his anatomy, with his knees bent in such a way and his elbow up in such a way, it comes directly from his own work on the Sistine ceiling. It seems to be an almost cheeky way that Raphael is commenting not only on his overall moodiness by making him Heraclitus, but acknowledging the supreme work that Michelangelo was doing, which Michelangelo would have been very displeased to know that Raphael was looking at it at all. But here alone is the magnificence of Raphael, to so perfectly deploy the stylistic elements of Michelangelo that had not yet been revealed to the world in his own work in a way that is both subtle and gracious and works with the rest of his figures. It is so brilliant. And yet, if you look at the original cartoon, which I was very lucky to have gotten to see myself in Milan, is where it is today, the figure of the Heraclitus Michelangelo is not there, because there was meant to be an essential aspect of the painting that Plato and Aristotle, they are in stride, moving forward. They are going to walk down those stairs, the ones that now Michelangelo blocks, and leading the way, paving the path to view the rest of the room. This is what I mean, that this is not a work in isolation. They lead you to keep looking at the expansion of the hierarchy, not to the opposite wall yet, which we'll get to, because that is the climax. No, but they lead you along to the two side walls, the wall of law or jurisprudence, which shows both civil and canon law, the former through a portrayal of Byzantine Emperor Justinian handing over the Roman Byzantine law, and the other of Pope Gregory the Ninth, who has the laws of the church. And then opposite of that wall is poetry. A painting sometimes called Parnassus. That is in reference to the holy mountain Mount Parnassus in Greece, sacred to Apollo and to the Muses, the god and the inspiration for art and poetry. It is the Renaissance. Yes, we are in the Vatican. Totally fine to have a pagan deity here. And we see Apollo in the center playing his lyre, surrounded by the 9 muses of art and music and poetry. And all of the great poets are here and there about them. We see the blind Homer, whose head is tilted back in such a way his eyes are unseeing, but it is a clear reference to the sculptural group known as the Loakoon, one of the most famous works of ancient Roman sculpture from an earlier ancient Greek Hellenistic model, which was only rediscovered in 1506, 2 years before. And so Raphael is using direct reference to Roman art from Roman antiquity to create both the reference to a real sculpture in the Vatican collection and to add force to his anatomies and poses. So you use something as the tortured pose of the priest Loakoon for the head tilted back of the blind Homer. Homer is flanked by his heirs. Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid for Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, who then looks to the eagle-nosed Dante Alighieri, the 14th century poet of the Divine Comedy, the Florentine, who was highly inspired by Virgil and poetically took Virgil as a guide through the Inferno. We see also in the foreground the poet Sappho, and off to the right is Ovid. Petrarch and Boccaccio are in there too, among many other poets. It is a masterwork of all the great poets of the West, known to Raphael or known to the humanists and the rhetors who are helping him devise the plan for this room. These two scenes have a lot less of the master's hand, and much of it was done by either his workshop and assistants or the other masters collaborating with him, but these are Raphael's designs, surely, which was quite common. All of this really is to lead us to the painting on the opposite wall of the School of Athens, the Disputa, or the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, or theology, which is number 4 of this new knowledge scheme that Raphael devised. So we've done philosophy, law, and poetry. Theology is last and the highest in our hierarchy. This is a work often overlooked by the general overviews of Raphael, but it really is the whole point of this room. Everything else builds up to it. The School of Athens is Star Wars: A New Hope, which means it's the first step. It is an absolute masterpiece in its own right and in isolation, but really the Disputa is Return of the Jedi. The needed conclusion, not as masterful as the first, maybe, but the much needed end to the story. Does that all make sense? Got it. We don't need to talk about empire in here. Okay. This painting, Theology, Disputa, is the representation of theology itself as a school of thought, but also as an absolute. In the clouds, which makes a semicircular shape in magnificent perspective, curves are so much harder to do than straight lines, we see Christ enthroned, flanked by Mary and St. John the Baptist. Behind them, kind of behind above, is God the Father, and below, before, is the dove of the Holy Spirit, the Holy Trinity complete. They reside over an altar, the earthly emblem which holds the host, the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, the absolute ritual in which Catholicism derives its spiritual power. So the heavenly incarnation is the representation of the truth of the very real incarnation of the body and blood of Christ at the Mass, which is the bestowal of the Holy Trinity upon the faithful on earth itself. Theology. All of this is supported on the ground by the greatest theologians represented in this fresco in the exact same way that philosophers and poets are represented in the School of Athens in Parnassus, and they are below the heavenly entourage, reacting in a way to the altar. They also contain the same double portrait elements from the School of Athens, such as the church father Gregory the Great has the face of Pope Julius himself. So there's some legacy building going on here. He also includes his uncle, Pope Sixtus IV, a very polite nod to the nepotism that earned him his post. We see the great theologians and saints, Augustine, Ambrose. We see Jerome. Guess who else pops up in this one? Dante again. He gets two references. He's on Parnassus. He's in Disputa. He is on the right side. This painting is the sum. It is the end. It is the whole point. The composition itself is a masterwork where the perspectival plane of the earth is a rectangular one and it harmonizes with the semicircular one of the heavens, which is a direct quotation of Renaissance architecture, where the square is the earthly symbol and the circle, the heavenly symbol, such as the square base of a church, which often holds up a dome, which can also be symbolic of the Roman Pantheon, which is a sphere upon a drum, which was consecrated as a church. So there's all sorts of wonderful things happening here. But the true center of the whole composition of this artwork is the high altar in the Disputa painting, which is immediately across from the Plato and Aristotle in the School of Athens, who, as I said, walk towards it. It is the legitimizing of pagan philosophy under the religious order of the papacy. But these ancient thinkers walked a path that leads to the truth of theology. They do not contain the truth themselves. They are only the beginning of it. They do not represent an absolute concept of philosophical virtue to the Renaissance viewer. And so the Disputa is the conclusion to the School of Athens, not a separate piece, individually representative of theology, a conclusion that is supported by the production of art and poetry in Parnassus and supported by the secular and religious laws of the jurisprudence wall, all of which resides under the dominion of, guess who? The Pope. Wildly, this was Julius II's somewhat private space, his private library study, although, of course, works like this were not kept secrets at all. And it is also a space that gives the visual language of legitimacy to Roman humanism, to Rome as the new center of what we today call Renaissance. Because of the flow of the Vatican Museum itinerary, when you go to view this, I have disgustingly too many times heard people tell me when they come back from their trips, be it students or family or friends or whatever, I didn't see the School of Athens. Where was it? I missed it. How did I miss it? Blah, 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 blah. Typically, when you enter the Stanza della Segnatura, the School of Athens is at your back. So you enter the room and it's behind you, which means the Disputa is the first thing you see when you enter it. Oh, just another old religious work in the Vatican. No, 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 no. By now, you've seen hundreds of lavish rooms before you get to the Raphael rooms. And if you're not paying attention, you will walk into the Stanza della Segnatura, you will see the crowds, you will want to vomit, and you will push through, since it is also in this part of the sequence that you are getting really close to the Sistine Chapel, and that excitement is welling up inside of you. So you walk through the room, you do not look behind you, you miss the School of Athens, and what a fool are you? That is my little aside warning, just to say, A, appreciate the disputa. Who, why do you walk in and go, I don't know. People do that. I don't know. Come on, give me a break. B, remember to slow down. And I know it's the Vatican and it's grueling and it's hot and the people are annoying and you can't really appreciate things. But I've been to this place so many times, and I assure you, if you walk into the Stanza della Segnatura and you stop and you look at the School of Athens and you appreciate it as leading you to the disputa, by the time you're done and appreciating just a quarter of it, some of those groups will move on. Sometimes you'll find yourself in that room with just a few people. Just enjoy it, because it's really, really, really remarkable. Renaissance people, I could do 100 episodes on the decoration of the Vatican, but alas, for now, this concludes our treatment of the High Renaissance in the Vatican Palace. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it, but we have to go elsewhere in Rome, and Raphael has far more fame to accumulate before his very early death in 1520. So stay tuned, and until next time, arrivederci.